Hi everyone, my name is Aled Davis, founder of MediatorAcademy.com, home of the passionate mediator. This is the place where mediators, aspiring, new and accomplished, come and learn from experienced mediators, practitioners and thought leaders from around the world. The people we interview are generous with their time and they share their knowledge and experience with you so that you can learn, grow and improve your effectiveness and hopefully be inspired to go out into the world, build your own success story, make a difference and leave a legacy. Now in this interview, I want to understand more about narrative mediation, the process and skills used, the types of dispute this approach might be best suited, and explore the theoretical basis for narrative mediation. My guest today is a professor at the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason University. In this context, teaches and conducts research on the relationship between narrative and violent conflict. She's also the director of the Center for the Study of Narrative and Conflict Resolution. Formerly, she was the director of the Program on Negotiation at Harvard Law School and has held positions at a variety of Tier 1 research institutions. She's consulted to and/or conducted training for a host of public and private organizations, as well as a number of universities in Europe and Latin America. She's been a leader in the fields of negotiation and conflict resolution studies, conducting research on the practice of neutrality, as well as the production of turning points and critical moments in negotiation processes. Some of this research is based on case studies from her field research in Guatemala, Chile, Rwanda, and the Netherlands. And I am very excited and delighted to welcome Dr. Sara Cobb onto Mediator Academy. Sara, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Sara, I'd like to understand narrative mediation from a theoretical and practical perspective and understand whether and how one informs the other. And I have to start by asking you about the story of narrative mediation.
Okay. Well, let's see. Let's start at the beginning, which is a good place to start. Narrative mediation was born from a growing body of literature derived from narrative theory predominantly, but also more broadly from social constructionism. And about in the 1980s, there came a critique of the ways we thought about knowledge and its production. And people, theorists and practitioners realized that much of what we know that is created through conversations and through interaction with other people. It's not like we have these ideas in our heads that stand outside of the conversations we have and the way we interact with other people. So the social constructionist thesis really began to blow up traditional ways of understanding both negotiation and then later on mediation, in the sense that the ideas that people, the problems that people had, began to be understood not as fixed phenomena that were inside of them, but rather in the nature of the stories they told and in the way in which they formulated those problems, so that the story about the problem began to be as real to practitioners and to theorists as the problem itself.
Okay, so one's experience of a particular situation, of a particular problem, might be very different from the way we explain that to somebody else.
Well, I guess what I'm really saying is not that experience and description are separate, but more that the way we account for things, the stories we tell about things, actually shape the things we describe in the world.
Okay.
So that what we do is produce the problems through the nature of the descriptions that we create about those problems. And if you change the description, you change the problem. Now, if you've got, 500,000 people without water, and you describe that situation, and then you want to change it to, it's a situation that has to do with, for instance, poor governance, it's not going to deliver water to the 500,000 people, but it can help alter the the way in which people see what's available to do gets them outside of the frame that they've been in that has been so contentious and difficult. So, people have talked about frame changing and changing the story, but this all grows out of this social constructionist assumption that we constitute our world through the descriptions that we make about it. And those descriptions are productive of both conflict, very, very contentious, protracted, violent conflict, as well as productive of its, if we change these descriptions, productive of the evolution and transformation of the not only our descriptions, but our experience, because indeed our experience follows our descriptions.
Okay, so we in effect we create the problems that we experience unwittingly.
Yes, and then in the bless our hearts, the way in which we go about solving the problems or addressing the problems actually entrenches not only the problem but ourselves, because we have we limit the range and the diversity of the ways in which we construct the issues that we face, and then we're surprised because we can't come up with any solutions. And then what do people do? They tell the story louder, they tell it harder, they tell it more with more vehemence, and then eventually, after the other side stops listening, they resort to violence. So what we've got is a situation where the people themselves, all of us, and I include myself in this, are stuck in the stories we tell, which, by the way, now here comes a big footnote, are not of our own making. In other words, the stories that we tell if we're, a Palestinian refugee, are stories we have circulating in our communities, in our families, in our homes, in our mosques, in our grocery stores. And speaking other stories than the ones that are dominant is, kind of a form of heresy. And it's very socially regulated. It's kind of policed to make sure we only tell certain kinds of stories. So if you join a feminist group and you want to talk about how much you love to make dinner for your husband, well, that's going to be a problem, because that kind of story has been, in the past anyway, restricted because it's policed out of the sort of storytelling that can occur in a feminist group. So the restrictions on stories are not only a function of our own limitations, but they're a function of the cultural limitations on what can be said, what's appropriate for a given context. And from that perspective, all of us are stuck in stories we didn't make up by ourselves. And then we can't change by ourselves. And that's the reason for third-party processes, is that the stories have us quite caught. And then what we, as I mentioned, what we do to try to evolve the situations and develop solutions for ourselves is a form of repetition of the same stories. And usually the more you tell a story, the shorter, more condensed it gets. And then people have shortcut ways of telling those problematic stories. And that's certainly the case in violent conflict, where you've got both sides telling the same story over and over and over again at home, in their communities, in their schools. And then over time, that story has condensed into sort of like a black hole where it sucks in all the light and energy that could be generated if people were to think of things differently. So these stories really, it's not just that we have them, but that we are policed by them, and these stories police our the options we have in the way, that limit the options we have in terms of conflict resolution. So narrative mediation is a way of first understanding that we speak and that we experience our world in stories, and that the stories themselves are quite problematic, and that people left to their own devices are not likely to be able to reorganize these things, precisely because narratives have their own regulatory processes. So structurally, a narrative is composed of plots, characters, and themes, and it's a closed system.
Right.
And just like any other closed system, if you alter the plot, you alter the characters and the themes. If you alter the themes, you alter the plot and the characters. So it's like a kind of a kaleidoscope. situation. But what is interesting is that narratives, they have their own life force, really, and they do not like to be disturbed. They do not. So
why is that? Why is that?
well, I think that that let's say narratives and people that tell them, we as social beings prefer stability in the descriptions that we make and the relationships we establish. And we know our world through the stories we tell. So it's both the people and the stories that prefer not to have any kind of destabilization, that prefer stability and coherence and routine. So it's, if you change the story, let's say Putin were to change the story about the U.S., or if Obama is going to change the story about Russia, for instance, and right now there's a lot of contentious interactions, Putin himself would have to alter, and so would Obama, other kinds of stories, because this story about Russia, for instance, for Obama, exists in a constellation of other stories, right? About what the U.S. is and what we're trying to do and what makes us great and why the Russians are problematic and blah, blah, blah. Yeah. So because each story is nested inside a set of other stories, if you go about destabilizing this, a core story like the one the U.S. might have about Russia, you end up destabilizing a bunch of other stories as well. So these things kind of fit together like a jigsaw puzzle. Yeah. And for that reason, that's what people are up against when they go about altering the stories they're telling. They're up against not only the evolution of that story, but the evolution of all the stories that is coherently tied to.
So in order to change a story, one has to be mindful that there are other stories that would be connected to that main story.
Yeah, it reverberates in a landscape of narratives. So
changing one story would require changing a whole host of other stories.
So let's say change is a big word. Let's say evolving a given story will reverberate and have resonances with a set of other stories, and some of those resonances are too threatening for the overall coherence of a life and of a culture and of a way of being, So Obama's not going to stand up and say, we really have, for the last many years, operated as empire, and we never really learned the lessons from the Cold War, and we really need to step back and suggest to ourselves new ways of being on the international stage. He's not going to say that because it's too destabilizing for the president to reorganize how he sees the U.S. and how we see ourselves. It's just, so any slight changes he makes has got to be, it's again policed by the fit it has with other stories. And I'm using that word police a lot, and it's really a word that Jacques Rancière uses in a wonderful book called The Census. It's really philosophically super interesting. And he argues in there that the social order is policed, and it's not by the police. It is by this sort of discursive apparatus that keeps us telling the same stories and keeps us in the same narrative landscape. So does that make sense?
It makes sense. So people, not just those telling the story, but others around have invested in the story.
Oh man, yes. And that's why we have a lot of programs in conflict resolution that fail, because you can pull people out of their context and have them like dialogue or go to mediation or whatever. Look at the Oslo Accords, it's a perfect example. You pull these people out, they come to some great agreement and they see the world differently and they're so excited about it and they have these new narrative landscape that they're part of. They go home and whammo, the police shows up at the front door, metaphorically speaking, the discursive police, and begins to shut down these possible stories. So we have another program in the world called Seeds of Peace, which is a wonderful program that pulls Palestinian and Israeli kids into a summer camp together to dialogue and share and experience themselves and the other differently. And it's a wonderful program and it works. And then the kids go home. Yeah. And they're stuck back in the same families and the same schools and communities. And they can't tell those stories. They can't enact or materialize their new way of understanding the world. So we really have to start thinking of not only, that's why mediation, narrative mediation is also interesting. We have to start thinking not only of the people, the principles to a conflict, but their network and how that network can participate in the evolution and transformation of the stories that are problematic. So in Australia, there's been an allied movement that sort of supports, is a cousin, I would say, of narrative mediation, and it's conferencing processes. And the conferencing process, I don't know if you've had anybody on your show talking about it, is really about bringing the principles in, and then all the folks that they think are important to them and to discussing the conflict. So you might keep the principles talking about what the issues are, but in fact, everybody in the network that is important to them hears and is able to, tune themselves to the and participate, at least in listening to the evolution of the meaning that goes on in a narrative mediation process. Because when narrative mediation works, meanings evolve.
Yes.
They do. Stories evolve. It's enormously effective.
Okay, so thinking about, I mean, I already have a few sort of examples that spring to mind where I've been in a mediation and the party is telling a story, and it's, I think, I don't know if you would call it, is the thin narrative.
Yes, very thin. Yeah,
it's a very thin narrative, and they are really sort of entrenched in this story, and of course the other party has a different story.
Right.
And particularly, I mean, it's when we do neighbour disputes with a community mediation service that I volunteer with, it's, you've got one living on top of the other, and it's really, or next door to the other, and the stories that they tell are really interesting. But then you think about the families that live in, we try and invite all the family members into the conversation, because one of the concerns that we have, obviously, is they go back into the old context,
right,
and it makes it harder for them to share the experience that they've had in the room with their neighbour.
Yeah, well, that's a good example.
Yes. So when narrative mediation works, you say it works well. I like the distinction you made from the word sort of change to evolving a story. Yeah. I thought that's lovely. It's just a subtle change, but it in some way it doesn't. It gives validity to the current story. It doesn't say, this story is good or bad. It's not judging the story. It's saying it just needs to evolve. So how as a narrative mediator do you work with parties so that you help evolve this story? Is there a logical path, like a story arc or something in the mediation process? How does it work?
Well, I think that you'd find different narrative mediators answering that question differently. So let me start by saying I've got an opinion on that, and it's my opinion. So just to sort of a truth in advertising warning there, that what you're going to get is my perspective, obviously. And then I think that there is a logic to the evolution of narrative, and I have developed my own through my practice. In my view, what's core to any conflict is the social construction of legitimacy for self. I'm perfect, I'm great, I'm wonderful, and this other person has done this horrible thing and keeps on doing these terrible things because they're awful. So it's both the legitimacy of self and the delegitimacy of the other, and that thing is core to a conflict process. If you don't have that, you've got maybe a disagreement. You don't like my sweater that I have on, but I'm still a nice person. I'm a good person. So that might be an interesting difference we would have, but it's not a conflict. But conflict is really defined, in my view, as this condition where you've got reciprocal delegitimacy, where both parties are talking about the other one and framing the other one as either having bad traits, stingy, mean, fat, of the wrong religion or whatever, or bad intentions, which is you're really trying to hurt me and you're a bad person. In fact, you're evil, and I might as well just have to annihilate you because I can't do anything about it. Once somebody's constructed as evil, the only thing you can do is kill them.
Mm-hmm. So there's sort of
get away from.
reciprocal. Sorry, go on.
Go ahead.
I was going to reciprocal delegitimacy of self.
No, of the other.
Of the other. Okay. Sorry.
Right.
Yes,
So
that's right.
It's
Yeah, of the
both
other.
parties saying the other is terrible.
Yes.
Right. So if that's the core of a conflict, then I think the evolution of the narrative really involves a couple things. First, any mediator that wants to join must first join a narrative. And so in the course of my work, it's an important moment to try to join the narrative of both parties. And certainly I work with oftentimes intra-party work first, but because I'm really good at what I do, I can put two parties together and do the work with one party in front of the other. But some people prefer to work intra-party with this sort of narrative model. Anyway, so what I do is work to join the story first. And I think that that's a complicated thing to do, because what people offer you up as to the mediator is the narrative of I'm wonderful, the other's terrible.
Mm-hmm.
If you elaborate that, oh yes, I see. I can really, then you're actually participating in the delegitimization of the other. So, so the task is to try to elaborate and join this narrative, but without participating in that, in the politics, let's say, of delegitimizing the other. And I do that in a bunch of different ways, largely through questions. So I ask a lot of questions. And so the preamble that I do in a beginning of a mediation involves telling people, warning them that I am, limited in my understanding of things. And I first have to get a solid understanding of things. And so I'm going to ask a ton of questions to alert them to the fact that they're not going to be able to simply speak uninterrupted for 5 minutes. So if you watch me work, people start talking and I begin with these questions. So, and I begin in a direction, I begin asking these questions in a direction that does two things, really two directions at once. I'll ask questions first that construct the plot sequence, because that's at some level easiest to do with people. They usually give you 3 episodes. This happened, then that happened, and then this terrible thing happened. There's only 3, usually maybe 4.
Act 1, Act 2, Act 3.
Yeah, and what you want in the beginning of the mediation, because it's easy for people to elaborate more events, is I begin questioning the thinness of that plot line. So it's possible to have more events in it. Along the way, it becomes possible to begin to illuminate how, to begin to ask questions about the moral values that people are using to construct the other as terrible and the self as legitimate. Now that's tricky, because now you're really sort of at the heart of the issue. And people in the narrative start to, hold back. They're quite ready to elaborate the plot line, but when it comes to reorganizing the value systems, it's cards to the chest again,
Right, okay.
So in terms of from the narrative wants to protect itself. So I do a very interesting thing, and again, it's just mine, and not everybody does it this way. People always offer the terms of their own legitimacy. I'm wonderful because I'm intelligent. I'm wonderful because I'm productive. I'm wonderful because I'm honest. I work hard. I'm always loyal.
Yeah.
I'm a good neighbor. Whatever it is they are offering, and every value has just linguistically its opposite, right?
Right.
So if I'm intelligent, that has an opposite. Now, George Kelly in 1950 wrote a wonderful book called Theory of Personality, and he basically said that every idea, every concept occurs and lives in a construct, and a construct is 2 things. Mm-hmm. On the one side, it's whatever word it is, like intelligent, and it's its opposite, and that together forms the construct. Right. So what I do in the narrative mediation is begin to look for the constructs by asking people, if they tell me, well, you're I'm very, very intelligent, and of course I'm able to figure this out in the way that the other party is so stupid they can't possibly they might not use the word stupid, but I start to see these polarities, these constructs as polar systems.
Right.
And then I began to, and usually I do that by asking a question. When people have given me the terms of their legitimacy, I'll ask them, I'll say, look, every blessing has that you're very blessed to be so intelligent, and every blessing has its own shadow, its own complication, its own problem. And in your life, have you found, or in the course of this context, this difficulty you're in, or in other difficulties you've had,
Mm-hmm.
have you ever noticed any complication arise from you being intelligent? And people will say, "Oh yeah." I mean, if you ask me, I construct myself as very intelligent, and I'll tell you, "Oh yeah, well, I'm usually one of the problems I have is that I jump over things that I shouldn't because I'm sort of not with people. I'm sort of more interested in my own ideas than I am anybody else's, or that I don't listen like I should, or I'm too fast to promote my own perspectives rather than pay attention." So I'll tell you, and then I can ask, well, can you tell me a story? Can you describe that? Then
okay.
What that does, let me just finish this. What that does is fill out not only the oppositional of the intelligence, whatever people are constructing as opposite, because you can't presume that it's the linguistic opposite. The linguistic opposite is stupid of intelligence.
Uh-huh.
Linguistic opposite isn't stupid. But people may not find themselves having problems with stupidity. In life, Sarah, will have problems of listening, problems of, pacing, problems of connecting well, because I'm always so interested in my own ideas.
Mm-hmm.
That's the problem of being intelligent, is that I enjoy myself too much. So, then when you talk to me about that, I'll give you plenty of instances and examples of, my being with people and being surprised by the fact that I wasn't in sync with them, or that they didn't understand what I was saying, or that I ran over them instead of giving them space and time and all that, like I'm doing with you right now, for instance. So
don't worry, keep going.
Okay. So the purpose of this move is the following. And I talk about it in my writing as an ironic move, because what happens is, in this conversation, I can get people to hold both the ways in which they're wonderful and how that wonderfulness presents difficulties and problems and complications in their lives, or in this problem, or whatever conflict they're in, or in other parts of their life. Once they are more fully presented and more thickly described as not just perfect, but with this little other side to themselves, they're much more ready to tolerate the imperfections of the other.
Right.
So that is a move right there that I think is critical to the evolution and growth of the mediation, of the evolution of the stories in the mediation process. Because once that happens, they can give some legitimacy to the other,
mm-hmm.
and that becomes reciprocal as the other gives more legitimacy to them, and then they can talk about the history, the past. So the first move is really this ironic move of constructing, after joining, of constructing self, the speaker I'm talking with, as less than perfect. That leads to, I'm just going to do the sequence and then I'll let you talk, I'm sorry. That leads to the second move, which enables the other to hear them as more than just terrible, so that's a reciprocal move. I'm less than perfect, the other is more than just horrible.
Yeah.
That leads to the third step, where you can, together, people are able and ready to talk about the past differently. They can't talk about the past before they've made these shifts, because when they talk about the past, they simply do more reciprocal blaming and externalization of responsibility. But they can create what I call a circular history, which is, I did this, then you did that, then I did this, then you did that, together, once they've got these, the evolution of their positions and their construction of self and other is altered. The next stage, they can really do scenario planning, they can think of new things, they can step outside of the box and come up with new solutions. And the last stage, really a reflection back on the value systems that they see present in the sort of options they've generated and the choices they want to make. But but it's that first move that's like pushing a snowball, pushing a big boulder down the hill, and it gains momentum. And basically, I've argued that narrative has its own, what I would call, path dependency. In other words, it moves in the direction that it's going. So if you can push it in that little, get it started at least off the mark, it will gain its own momentum, and people will be able to generate new stories, or at least evolve the stories they're part of. Now, I'm sorry, I'm done.
Okay, so
I'm taking a breath. I'm sorry.
So after step 2, that's when the parties are more ready to acknowledge or reflect on their own contribution to the
Yes.
problem.
Yes, perfectly said.
Okay.
Yes.
Now, I'm curious about the idea of joining the story. Are you saying that you become one of the characters in the story by joining the story? Is that the...
Well, I'll definitely be a character in the story because I'm asking questions in a very, let's say, active, if not aggressive manner.
Okay.
And, again, I try very hard, and sometimes, I'm less successful than others because I have my own ways of interacting with people, and, smiling. And because I'm a woman, I get to smile at people, and, I have all the benefits, I would say, of being a woman, which allow me a sort of quality of connection, and I can touch people, for instance, if I feel like it. So I think that the way I have of joining has to do with, who I am and how I go about it, and other people have their own ways. But I definitely am a character in the story. I'm definitely involved in the evolution of the narrative, and I will present myself not as some mediators do, which is, I'm just here to facilitate the process and help you, talk to each other. No, I'm in here, me too, and I'm going to be actively engaged and, involved, implicated in the way in which the stories are told, and how, what happens here.
Okay, is part of that, the idea of that then, to develop a trust with the parties?
Yeah, the trust is sort of a confusing and hard thing to do, I think. And I think there's no formula for that, that I would say, but people want their stories elaborated. They really do. So it's respectful at some level to elaborate the story, to ask questions. Now, the pace of those questions, the nature of the questions, must be in line with, and, people in a way that they don't feel threatened, or they don't feel put off, or disrespected, or something like that. So, how do we join people? Oh, we know how to do it. You do it all the time. You do it with me, with your nice smile, and the way that we were interacting before the recording started. And, you do it with your family, and you do it with the grocer. We do it all the time. The question is, what are the terms and conditions for politeness and that signal respect and regard for people? And that's just sort of something we do. Mm. We might not know culturally how to do that in every place, but that's easy to say. Look, I'm just a kind of a dumb American, and I'm not, as culturally sensitive as I should be, and I know that, so help me, and if I become rude or disrespectful, tell me, don't just let me sit here and be stupid. So there are ways in which, I just think that we basically have the competencies we've got to join people out of everyday life, but, we try to work on, I think, as mediators, ensuring that we can pace ourselves with people. And the narrative mediation, because it's so deeply threatening to the coherence of the stories that people have, has to be even more respectful, I think, and that joining process is even more important.
Oh, this is really sounding fascinating. One thing I'm curious about then, when you get started, when you're when you're sort of joining a story, and you're probing and asking questions and getting very aggressive sometimes, as you might do, who do you start with? Because I imagine whoever gets started, and I often experience this sometimes when right now in my mediation life, I'm having turmoil in my head because experience transformative mediation as well as the problem-solving model of mediation. So problem-solving is you agree before everyone gets in the room who's going to speak first.
Yeah.
Transformative is like, okay, who wants to kick off?
Right.
And both, I've tried both, and both have worked quite well. How do you do it? How do you get that started? Because doesn't the first person that kicks off gets a bit of a dominant narrative started?
Yeah, Janet Rifkin and I did that research back in the early 90s, 1991, and we were able to show through videotape sessions of mediation that the first person to speak colonizes the space, and everybody else has to come along afterwards and say, no, but, no, but, no, but, yes, but, they have to defend themselves against the accusations that were the first parties. So what I do is, it depends. Sometimes a party calls me and asks me, and the other party agrees to have me. So I'll start with the party that calls and asks me. Sometimes I'm asked by a third party, and these two people the parties show up, and they didn't ask either one of them. They just happen to be, kind of coerced by this third party that could be a government or an NGO or something. Some NGO wants to convene a community mediation between blah, blah, blah about gangs, and the gangs they didn't want the mediation. They just are showing up because they're curious or they're pressured or something. So I'll tell people, look, I don't know where to start with all this, and I think I'm just gonna, maybe I would ask the person who, I would ask you, and I'll point to somebody, if you think you're able to start this off in a way that would be helpful to the process. Everybody's going to say yes. Oh, yes, I can be helpful. Oh, yes, I can start things up. Oh, yes, I'm not incompetent. Everybody answers. So I'll formulate a question so that the only answer I'm going to get is yes. And people will say yes. Now, if the other party says, no, but I want to speak first. And I would say, well, either we can stop and if I get that situation going, I'll ask the party that says that if they'd like to step outside, and I can have then 2 first sessions. And nobody speaks, and I'll just do intra-party work, and then I'll put them back together with a summary that I create. So I'll ask them, I said, well, we can stop, and you can go into the other room, and then I'll interview this person, and then I'll without you, and then I'll interview you without them, and then I'll put it together. We could do it that way, or we can just do it this way, and I can just try to make sure that I would use a word like regulate or take care of. You can sit there, and maybe what you do is, and I often say to people, why don't you raise your hand if you get to a 7? From a 1 to 10 of upset, if you get to a 7, I need to know that. So if I can do this interview without being totally horrible for you, it should be from a 1 to 6. If it goes to 7, we need to stop and go at it another way. And people occasionally raise their hands, and then I'll stop. But I would say that happens once out of every, it's about 10% of my mediations. It doesn't happen very often.
Okay.
So.
So it sounds like everything that you do, there's a purpose to every single question, every intervention that you make.
Yes.
You've thought about this.
Yeah, I have. A lot.
A lot.
I think that there are really a couple of schools of thought of narrative mediation, and mine is more, perhaps we could say, authoritarian, because I have I have ideas in my head about what should be and what is a better form story and what the story should look like when I'm done. I have clear ideas about that, and basically they should be more complex across plots, characters, and themes, and that people should be able to talk openly in front of the other about the ways in which they are wonderful and the ways in which they are less than perfect. And when I get those conditions in the narratives, they're basically better formed, but that's where I'm going. Now, there are other narrative mediators that, I would say have a less instructive, less authoritarian, more, let's say, that they find the path as it emerges. They don't have so much of a structural idea in their head about what constitutes a better formed story. So if you talk to the people from, for instance, down down under, in Adelaide in Australia, out of Michael White's Center in Dulwich. They want to promote things like, social justice, or they want to have stories anchored on hope. So they'll ask questions that turn a story from being centered on pessimism and feeling defeated to a story that exhibits and materializes this notion of hope.
Yeah.
And that's a much more general aspiration, I think, that they're able to tell. They've got criteria for how they would know a good story from a not so good story.
Yeah.
But because the Dulwich Center has been dealing with therapy for a long time, and those are problems that individuals have, or individual families, or maybe even, and they've expanded their work to communities. Whereas I've been thinking about, entire regions of Guatemala where you've got reparations to the indigenous people from the state of Guatemala with North American NGOs intruding, and it's a much bigger ball of wax, and so I need more clarity. I cannot just support the evolution of stories in a sort of generally a better direction. I have to have some idea about where I'm going. So
yeah.
I have a more structured approach from that reason. But I used to be a school teacher.
So particularly when you've got
I've raised 7 children. So you don't raise 7 kids without putting this finger up occasionally.
I mean, I
do this to narratives on a regular basis.
I struggle to hold one thing in mind. My children started back school today, and the only thing I had to remember to ask this morning was whether there was choir practice for my daughter when I took her in, and I forgot to ask. So
I know the feeling.
Okay, so parties have stories, and you get firmly into their stories, become part of the story.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of first step in this kind of narrative process. I want to now move on to, and you've just touched on it. Actually, it's conveniently sort of segueing into the mediator's story.